Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Today with me are Daniel Martin, partner at HFW, and Michelle Weiss-Buckman, our senior maritime analyst here at Windward. And today we want to talk a little bit about the not so recent anymore. It was in July, I think, the 18th sanctions package adopted by the EU, where they introduced a few more ways to counteract Russia in the Russia-Ukraine war. They lowered the oil price cap even further. They added over, I think it was 100 tankers back in the day to the sanctions list. And they also introduced a new prohibition on importing refined petroleum products that are derived from sanctioned and regulated Russian crude, even when it's refined in third countries. Now, the lookback period started back in November already, but the official starting date of this new prohibition is on January 21st, next week, essentially. And we wanted to kind of focus on what it means in practice. What will stakeholders have to do starting next week? What does it mean for documentation, traceability of the trade flows, and just give a more practical advice on what can be done with this very vague, I have to say, prohibition that they came out with. Before we dive right in, please leave any questions that you have in the Q&A section below. We will make sure to allocate some time at the end for questions. And please keep in mind that this session is under the Chatham House rules and nothing is for direct quotation. If you require further commentary on quotes following the webinar, feel free to reach any one of us personally. So with that, welcome Daniel and welcome Michelle. And let's start. So Daniel, I would love to start with you and start at the top. Since the EU announced this 18th package back in July, how has the framework actually taken shape and evolved through the guidance that they released and the FAQs they released after the official announcement? And what are the biggest uncertainties that companies are now still facing?
Wonderful. Hi, Hila, and morning to everyone. Thanks for joining us and thanks for the chance to talk to you. I mean, you're right. You described it as being uncertain, and there are so many questions at the moment. We are a week away from the ban coming into force. The sort of timeline is the original regulation was back on the 18th of July 25. We then saw FAQs in October 25 on the 29th. And those who are familiar with the way we've seen EU sanctions evolve will not be surprised to hear that we have a very short Article 3MA in the regulation, and actually all of the information, all of the detail really, to the extent that we have it, is in the FAQs. So a strong recommendation for those on the call that if people have just read the regulation, you really need to take a look at the FAQs. They really do give you the sort of bread and butter. And essentially what they do is they, broadly speaking, we'll come into this in more detail, I think, but set up four main categories in terms of countries that we need to be concerned about. In terms of questions, I think I would focus on three main areas. Questions around the quality of the attestations that people will have to ask for. We are seeing, to some extent, a repeat of oil price cap issues with attestations of compliance and reliance on those documents, but equally questions around whether customs authorities in EU importing nations will ask for more information. So really, I think that will evolve over time, and there'll be different approaches. Secondly, there is a category of countries from which refined petroleum products are coming, which trigger a requirement for enhanced due diligence. And I still think questions there around what that means specifically in terms of the actual checks that need to be carried out.
Okay.
And that's really where we come into issues like the 60-day look back that you've talked about. And I think thirdly and operationally, there's a sort of an assumption with these measures that because the process involves asking questions of the refinery, those questions will best be asked before product is loaded on board the vessel. And therefore, it seems to me that there are questions around what will happen if at the time cargo is loaded, it is not known that it's intended for the EU, but that changes en route. And therefore, how do we keep updated and make sure we keep getting the documentation we need? But so for me, those are the three broad areas where there's still questions.
Perfect. Thank you. So with those three pillars, let's say in mind, what should companies be most focused on in terms of due diligence and exposure, and especially for those cargoes that are already underway on the water since November, even the look back period, or recently just approaching the 21st?
So I think there's two things to think about at the moment. And I think you're absolutely right that given we're a week away from the prohibition coming into force, and that's a prohibition on import as well as purchase or transfer, people need to be thinking about it with cargoes that are on their way. Essentially, people need to be thinking about two things. One is around due diligence, and the other is in terms of existing and future cargoes. And the second really is on contractual terms, ensuring that we have got the contractual requirements that you need to get the documents. So in terms of that DD, as I alluded to briefly before, essentially the way the prohibition functions is that there are four main categories of producers. There are the partner countries, which are the likes of the UK, the US, Canada, Norway. For
Mhm.
those countries, there will be a focus on evidence that the product actually derives and is it being exported from those countries. Secondly, we have the net exporter countries, which are countries which the EU has identified as being historic net exporters of crude, and therefore the inference is that they will not be taking Russian crude. Similar sorts of evidential issues in terms of proving that that is the origin of the cargo, but there will be concerns there around the evolving status of the net exporters, questions around the possibility of products being mixed in those jurisdictions, and indeed that position, that evidence that the products were produced in that country is sufficient is a rebuttable presumption. In other words, the customs authorities can ask for more evidence. So that's the second category. Third category is a bit of a residual category. In that category, we would want evidence as to the origin of the crude oil that is used as part of the production. And the fourth category are high-risk countries, so Turkey, India, China, or countries where mixing is common, and there's the enhanced due diligence required. So I think in terms of immediate action, cargo in the water, you need to know where it came from to work out which of those four buckets it fits into. And then secondly, in terms of priorities, thinking about contractual terms to ensure that the purchase contract that you have in place gives you contractual rights to insist, A, that the cargo complies with 3MA, but also that you can
Yeah.
require production of documents. And indeed, it needs an ongoing obligation to produce, because if you find yourself facing requirements for additional documents from customs in the import country, you need to be in that position.
For sure. It reminds me of a past briefing that me and you did on how contracts have evolved in the maritime domain, and that just adds another complexity and more clauses that they have to think about now, which they haven't had to include
Yes.
before.
You will get to the point where the sanctions provisions are longer than the rest of the contract, just because of all the complexity.
For sure. Thank you. And Michelle, now I would love to get you into the conversation, because the legal exposure only matters if it actually maps and correlates with real world trade flows and movements. So I want you to help us look at what's actually moving and changing. Now, based on our data, and we use a lot of Vortexa data to see the trade flows, who is the most affected by this new prohibition? Do we already see routes or regions or product movements kind of changing? How does it play out in real life currently?
Thanks a lot. And good morning, everyone. So, what I'll probably do is just step back and give you just an oversight about the EU refined product import landscape. Um, just for just for way of explanation, European refineries produce more gasoline that they need, and they don't produce enough diesel than demand. So the bloc is actually the largest regional importer of Middle East distillates, which is diesel, gas oil, and jet fuel. So primarily, when we're talking about this ban on Russia-derived refined products from Russia-derived crude, this is what we're talking about. So pre-2022, about 45% of all diesel was imported from Russia. So there's been a complete recalibration of global refined product trades as a basis from this. So that has seen a turning to India and Turkey, as well as the Middle East, for middle distillate imports now. And of course, the Middle East Gulf suppliers are viewed as net exporters, so they're not coming under this ban. So India EU imports, according to Vortexa, our commodities tracking partner, were just over 200,000 barrels per day of diesel in 2025. Turkey, we're talking about 120,000 barrels per day of diesel. Both do small amounts of jet fuel. That tends to come from the Middle East Gulf. And then China, only about 18,000 barrels per day. And these are mostly arbitrage trades. And of course, China is not a major uh, product exporter to the Western Hemisphere anyway. So we're looking at about 300,000 barrels per day. Some figures a little bit higher, but roughly 25% of all middle distillate imports from outside the EU 27. India and Turkey are about the fourth and fifth largest suppliers, And unsurprisingly, Saudi Arabia is the largest, with record imports to Europe from Saudi Arabia last year at about 500,000 barrels per day. In terms of India, Turkish imports of Russian-grade crude in 2025, India was about 1.8 million barrels per day. Turkey was about 300,000 barrels per day. China is the largest importer, and that's at about 1.3, 1.4. That's seaborne, plus you add pipeline and stuff added from the pipelines as well. So as you can see, quite a significant exposure, and we're already seeing changed behaviors, which we can extrapolate later on. But, that's just a picture of what we're looking at. And of course, quite a substantial enforcement challenges for customs, which of course are the primary, they're going to be the ones making the decisions at the ports.
For sure. So you mentioned that we already see it shifting. So we're already seeing adjustments to
Sure.
those numbers.
Yeah, we are. So I had a look at India's imports of Urals. So that's the biggest Russian export grade. So in December, they were under 1 million barrels per day. And that was the lowest monthly level since the price cap was introduced in December 2022. So there are dual pressures on Russia crude. There's also this pressure. But don't forget, in October, the UK and also the US placed sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil, which are the largest producers of Russian crude. So in January, I've only seen one Russian cargo go into Sika's Jamnagar terminal in January. Now, they've said that they're going to segregate their imports into domestic and export. And with Turkey, I've only seen 8 Urals cargoes arrived at refineries, exporting refineries there since December 6th, and they're primarily from Primorsk and Ust-Luga. So I think there's already changed behavior, and very early days. Since the look back period, I think there've been 3 cargoes that I've gone into the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp network. One of them was a new build Suezmax tanker. So usually Suezmax tankers are built for crude exports, but sometimes their first voyage is a clean cargo. And in this case, we saw a clean cargo of about 1 million barrels come from from Jamnagar, from a segregated mooring export area, and then go through to there. So very, very early indicators, obviously, because the ban's not even taken impact.
Of course.
But, we can see that it's having an effect already.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And while we still, Daniel.
I was just wondering whether it's helpful because we're focusing on those particular aspects, whether it's worth, in case people haven't seen, the guidance, just talking what the EU has to say about these sort of particular issues with refineries which are taking Russian crude, but also others, because I think it's probably helpful in terms of helping people to understand the sorts of diligence they will need to do in terms of understanding the issues. So again, and this is one of the areas in which the guidance really amplifies the regulation, and the regulation is pretty thin on this point. It just says you may not import. Essentially what the guidance talks about 3 distinct scenarios, and this is really why it's important, the points that Michelle is making around sort of segregation and why these are coming to the fore. Because what the guidance essentially says is, if you're looking at a refinery which is taking both Russian and also other crude, then scenario number 1 is a scenario in which the Russian crude can be segregated and processed separately by the refinery, such that you would essentially have one production line which is just for non-Russian, which is then destined for the EU, and essentially they would keep the Russian crude that they were using for other purposes. Now, in order to be able to rely on that as a basis to import into the EU, those entities which are importing will need evidence that that was indeed the case. The suggestion from the guidance is that an attestation will be sufficient as supporting evidence. So essentially, you would have an attestation from the refiner, which they say we segregate. And questions there for people around the extent to which people are willing to rely on attestations, particularly given what we've seen happen on oil price cap cargoes and concerns about those. There is a suggestion in the guidance that you might ask for further documentation of segregation, so including technical installations and adaptions, records of vessels that have delivered crude in the past. But of course, that assumes that the refinery is happy to share that information. And I think one of the things that we'll see evolve over weeks and months is if there is a consistent position of all buyers from the refinery that becomes the minimum standard, then that will be an easier discussion if everyone's insisting on it. And then I think the alternative, and I mean, it's sort of worth touching on the look back point, is the alternative position. And I think there's probably a more oil apt analogy, but certainly we're muddying the waters a little bit here. But here's the situation in which they cannot be segregated. And therefore the refinery says we're not able to run two separate chains. Now, in that scenario, the only way in which the crude could be imported into the EU is if the refinery was able to demonstrate that they hadn't taken any Russian crude in the 60-day period, which is prior to the BL date for the refined products
Yeah.
which are coming out. Now, arguably even more difficult attestation to rely upon, because we are talking not about a physical process to separate out, but the absence of cargo. And therefore, I think this is partly where the concern arises about the fact that we are a week from implementation, but we've got this longer look back period, is that refineries will suddenly be being asked this question. And indeed will need to have the evidence to show the vessels that called. But I think, and then clearly the third category is one in which cannot be segregated, cannot get the assurance that no Russian crude has arrived, and in that case, you simply wouldn't be able to import. Others more knowledgeable than I am on the call will know why the 60-day period has been set. But I think we will see issues where, or at least you can imagine a scenario in which a refinery structures its deliveries so that you take some Russian, you then got a 60-day period in which you can then start discharging. But yeah, it will be interesting to see how that evolves. Sorry, I don't want to cut, but I
No,
just
it's
like to
super
explain
interesting.
why we're looking at the flows.
It's very interesting to see how it will play out. I mean, the refineries must have some sort of incentive to either build a segregated pipeline for each, or for attestations. It's a game of trust between all the stakeholders, essentially. And I think that if the refineries won't have a strong enough incentive, we won't see them rushing to do anything that they're not used to. But that's just my my take on it.
I think that's a really good thought. I think you're absolutely spot on, because presumably the question becomes, if we know that India has historically supplied 200,000 barrels per day to Europe, what is the premium for Europe on those products as opposed to selling to a different market that would cause the refinery to invest in the technology
Yeah.
and the equipment? And querying, and without sort of wanting to stretch things, we have seen on oil price cap a need for operators to be aware of market conditions in terms of price of oil, not just relying on attestations. And I think people having an understanding of the economic backgrounds to this is important, because there may well be some refineries in which it simply wouldn't be cost effective to segregate, and therefore that would presumably cause the attestation to call into question. Yeah, no, good point.
It's down
Really
to their
interesting.
ROI, to their margins. It's just it will play out with that at the end. It's all about the money.
Absolutely.
So we know that there are adjustments, and as Michelle mentioned, it will still take a while until we see the greater kind of shifts in the trends and the movements. But I want to ask you, Michelle, where do we still see, with these adjustments in place, and maybe the segregated pipelines or not, where do we see the biggest risk points emerging today, whether it's around the refinery sourcing, the reliability of the claims and the attestations? How do you see it happening? And do you think potential deceptive shipping practices will it be increased in an attempt to bypass this prohibition?
Well, sort of all of the above, Elas. So I think in the early days of the oil price cap, for example, what we saw were, like this is all about arbs, and clean flows are directed by the arbitrage of the arbitrage flow. We saw, for example, a lot of Middle East Gulf net exporters of refined products imported really cheap Russian diesel, which they used domestically, and then they were able to re-export expensive diesel that they produced themselves back to Europe. So I think, we will see, a recalibration of those trades. And for example, India will most likely find more markets in Africa and South America, just like Russia has, and that we will see increased flows from the US and from the Middle East Gulf. And of course, that's, if you're a maritime or if you're a ship owner and you've got clean product tankers, I think you're kind of happy about that because it's additional ton miles, even as the Red Sea potentially reopens if Houthi activity remains lower. So that's a positive there. Deceptive shipping practices. Again, the early days of the oil price cap always serve as a good indicator. I think ship-to-ship transfers of cargoes which help obfuscate the origin of the product are probably going to be another also used. And then, of course, we have the attestation documentation itself. And I think if we all remember from the first year and a half of the oil price cap when the grade, Russia's Urals grade was above that $60 a barrel level then, even though those cargoes were clearly priced above, attestation documentation was being used and relied upon to ship likely non-compliant cargoes. So, what sort of reliance will there be on attestation documents, not only by the traders, but by the customs? And of course, you've got 27 different customs authorities. Is there going to be any unification of how they will rely upon those? And of course, there's just so many uncertainties at the moment.
The requirements, if they all kind of align on what they require from each attestation or from the
I think that's
providers, if
Yeah. Enhanced due diligence isn't outlined in the frequently asked questions. So there's ambiguity there. And of course, what customs authorities, will accept hasn't been outlined because it's different countries. So yeah, very, very, very uncertain. And we're only 7 days away, and there's been very little indication from individual countries, let alone from the EU itself, as to what's expected.
For sure. It can also create a situation where one customs authority is being more lenient or more loose on what they require than another one. And that can also cause a shift in trade flows and intake of crude.
Well, I
It
think
will be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, the area to watch is the Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Antwerp area because that's where most of the diesel and especially jet fuel comes in for storage and for consumption. So the attitudes of customs authorities there's probably going to give some indication across Northwest Europe. And of course, I think in the Med, there may be different enforcement measures or attitudes as well. We just don't know yet.
For sure. So that takes us back to enforcement, Danielle. In practice, do you expect more enforcement pressure from the regulator, from the EU on the customs authorities? Or what would the contractual warranties look like in case of such an enforcement pressure?
Good question. So let me take enforcement first and then come back to the contract warranties. I think just sort of running with points that Michelle's already developed. So it's clear that it's for the customs authorities to make these decisions and to determine whether particular products can be imported. Where the rubber is going to hit the road then is a scenario in which a tanker is sitting waiting to berth and discharge. And therefore the customs authorities will be under pressure to make quick decisions, I think. I entirely agree with Michelle that ARA is where the primary focus will be, but there will be other importing locations where customs authorities have to make decisions. It's interesting, certainly to me and hopefully to others on the call, that what we don't have within the mechanism of 3MA is a requirement to share information. So this isn't like some of the other provisions that people might have seen, where if a national competent authority issues a license, it then has to be shared. So I think it is absolutely the case that there's nothing baked into Article 3MA that requires information sharing between customs authorities. That said, there is a strong past experience profile, call it what you will, of national competent authorities working with each other to be consistent, whether it's around classification of goods, whether it's around anti-dumping, all those sorts of issues. So there are mechanisms in place to share information. But I think, the bulk of the focus on enforcement will come from the customs authorities. There are questions as to whether, if it were to be the case that without naming names, a particular member state was perceived as being too lenient, then I think there would then be scope through Commission or Parliament or Council for pressure from a group of member states on others to take a different view or to share information about why decisions are being made, and if we might see that happen. I think The other thing that can be done at a sort of supranational level rather than custom authorities in member states is we might see an amplification of these FAQs and more information around what is meant by enhanced due diligence. We already know from the FAQs that the list of net exporter countries will be reviewed and updated every year. So it may well be that if there are concerns around particular jurisdictions that are identified as net exporters, but are actually a way for, as the EU puts it, for Russian oil to come in by the back door, they might be identified through the FAQs. We might see designation of refineries. I think, obviously the conversation that we're having is against a backdrop of vessels being physically seized because of sanctioned cargoes on board. And therefore we might see some of that. I think here things are a bit less, potentially a bit less emotive and a bit less black and white than Russian crude on the tanker. But that may evolve. I think the other thing to think about before I come on to the sort of contract terms and how they play in is, of course, as well as the primary prohibition that we've been talking about on purchase, import, or transfer, there are prohibitions on providing brokering services, financial assistance, and insurance.
Yeah.
So clearly, lots of the pressure around compliance here, as ever, will come from banks, insurers, and others who are involved in the trade. And I think, as we've seen on price cap, we will see that push through. I don't know whether you could see a scenario in which, right, clearly these are additional documentary requirements and therefore additional checks are being carried out. That seems to me to raise a risk of delays at the ports if tankers are hanging around waiting for those decisions to be made, and whether that will then begin to apply commercial pressure on particular ports. That if you have a port which has limited capacity but is making a decision to allow vessels which need further checking in, then will the loss of berthing fees or delays in those cause them to think actually it's not worth taking that one ship that's difficult, and therefore a bit of commercial pressure. And on the contracts and the attestations and things, clearly an attestation or a contract warranty is helpful as between the parties, but ultimately having an attestation doesn't seem to me to be a defense in the event that there's a breach of the prohibition.
Okay.
Clearly, the attestation is good practice, and I would expect it to be taken into account. And I would expect that if an attestation was on its face credible and there was no reason to think it was not accurate, then that would not lead to enforcement, but might lead to a request from a national competent authority to an entity to do more and to understand red flags, etc., etc. And I think similarly in terms of the warranties, of course, those are binding as between the parties, and a breach of those will lead to contractual claim. But again, as ever with all of these things, they are a useful way to demonstrate to regulators and others that people are taking things seriously. I think also, I know we've got banks and insurers on the call, but I think they will be expecting owners, traders, etc., to provide evidence that they are contracting on these sorts of terms to identify and manage the risk. But I think so. Just to wrap up, then, so enforcement from competent authorities, customs, and the contracts are important, but they're not necessarily the end of the day.
Perfect. Thank you. So to wrap this up, I want to ask you both, looking forward, how do you think from your own perspective, will this 18th sanctions package will succeed in closing the refined products loophole that emerged in the last couple of years? And if you had to give one piece of advice to our audience on the line preparing for next week, what would it be? Michelle, let's start with you.
Well, I think we have to look at the backdrop where Europe is now developing its 20th sanctions package, and it's very febrile. I mean, especially in the Baltic, where the threat of shadow fleet tankers is quite significant. And of course, looking at the action that was undertaken in Venezuela and the seizure of shadow fleet tankers in the Caribbean and one in the North Atlantic. So when you look at that, there's mounting pressure in the EU to stop all energy commodities derived from Russia, including LNG. Obviously, crude bans are well in place. The oil price cap is likely to be scrapped. So everything's getting tougher. So I think there are some schools of thought that it would be cleaner and less ambiguity if there were actually direct sanctions on refiners, like there was on the Vadina refinery in India, which was 49% owned by Rosneft. It's a lot easier to say nothing can come from there. So I think that's probably being weighed by some countries as well. So the success, if you look at this in terms of how successful was the oil price cap? Well, the oil price cap is practically redundant now. And I'm not saying this could happen, but the 20th package could very easily put some direct sanctions on refineries. Yeah. It, the environment is just too uncertain to forecast with accuracy. But if I can just end by, as I was putting my research together, I was looking at the certificates of origin which were being relied upon for refined product exports, imports into the EU. And there was a Wall Street Journal story published in December that referenced Russian diesel that was still being shipped from a storage terminal in Turkey to a Mediterranean country in the EU. Russian diesel was coming into that storage terminal, and then volumes shipped from there were 4 times as much as it had taken from non-Russian sources. But the EU anti-fraud investigators weren't able to prove that the Russian fuel entering that sort of network of storage terminals was the same fuel that was leaving for the EU. So there's just so much ambiguity that I think, once again, it's going to be very, very difficult to properly enforce this, unless, of course, the EU decide to make a high-profile case.
Mm.
So I'm a little bit negative about its success, I guess.
Daniel, do you share Michelle's thoughts?
I'm going to try to be a bit more positive, but only really in a kind of lawyer's way by kind of reframing the question. So, I mean, it seems to me depends how you define success. Is it going to stop all product derived from Russian crude coming to the EU by the back door? If living in the real world, the answer has to be no. I think you have a high value product. You have an impossible situation of knowing the truth and a reliance on documentation. But does it have the potential to substantially reduce? I think it does, but I think it's going to be driven by the risk appetite of traders, banks, and insurers, not necessarily by enforcement. So I think by focusing the mind of, as I say, traders, banks, insurers on the compliance organizations and understanding that, and by making them ask the questions, then I think there is you can have an effect, but I don't think it can reduce it to zero, because I think there is always I think it's fair to say there will always be a parallel trade. There is money to be made, and therefore there are those who will seek to make that money.
Shipping always finds a way. Okay, we have a few questions on the line. The first one, I think it's for you, Daniel. Does this apply to supplies to third countries by EU operators?
So no, it doesn't. So the EU guidance is very clear that the purpose of the prohibition is to stop Russian crude coming into the EU by the back door, and therefore it's purely limited to EU imports.
Okay, perfect. We have a large amount of distillate is traded via price discovery windows operated by Platts and ICE. If you are participating in those windows, how can you comply with these EU sanctions? Are you heavily reliant on Platts or ICE or ICE? I'm not sure how to read it out.
Yeah, that's Intercontinental Europe Trading Exchange, on which so diesel is traded as a differential against ICE gas oil futures. So, and the trades are done in the Platts window. But what the question is, what was the question related to with the Platts window?
If you are heavily engaged and operating in the windows by Platts and ICE, how can you make sure you comply with the new EU sanctions?
Well, that's a tough one. I think they give the cargoes when they put all the information in the window. So I guess you have to look at the cargoes and the name, and the ships. But some of the barge distillates, for etc., will come. That they'll be in storage tanks.
Mhm.
So I guess if it's in a storage tank in Rotterdam and it's already there, then it's okay. That's just my very rough assessment. I don't know if Daniel agrees.
Yeah, I don't know enough about it to know whether these particular cargoes on the window were traded on exchange, such that essentially the exchange matches, and therefore I would expect that the exchange will have to make some sort of rep and warranty as to whether essentially it's good product for trade. Where it may be different if the exchange matches individual parties and they then go off and trade bilaterally. So I think that's the critical difference for me is what is the role of the exchange. but equally, and we've seen this across a number of different exchanges, whether we look at metals or we look at precious metals, and the exchanges are well aware of the legal restrictions, and therefore I would expect that they would be implementing the controls that they need to ensure that either through vetting participants or vetting cargoes, that the trade is lawful. But it's a good question. It's certainly one that is important to ask the exchange.
Thank you. I'm not sure you will have the question for that, but maybe from your clients, you might know, how are banks implementing the enhanced due diligence requirement for the EU operators? Is there a focus on attestations to manage the risk or transactional due diligence? I'm not sure we know the answer.
Yeah, I certainly couldn't answer across all banks, but I don't think that banks will be comfortable relying exclusively on attestations. I think
I
given
think
it's
so
sort of
too.
implicit, yeah, I think that's right. I think because it's implicit through the guidance that the scope for further documents to be requested, and there's a need to verify the reliability of the attestations. You know, we're not talking about documents which are certificates final in the sort of trade sense, and therefore I think DD would be expected if not mandatory.
I agree. Are there similar UK sanctions? Do we expect all EU guidance will mirror UK guidance? Should exclusively British companies implement all of these rules, the same as an EU company?
Okay, so taking that in turn, the UK has said that it will adopt a similar prohibition. The language of the EU and the UK regulations will differ purely from a sort of legal standpoint. If the price cap is anything to go by, then we would expect close alignment between the EU and the UK, and therefore a similar focus. So I think, given where we are in terms of sequencing, I think any operator should be adopting controls in line with the EU at the moment, and then we see what comes from the UK and then adjust. But as I said, I mean, we've seen nuances between the UK and the EU position on oil price cap, but broadly speaking, I would say that I would expect them to be aligned.
Especially if they'll go ahead and, as Michelle mentioned, sanction the refineries. I assume the alignment will be quicker if that happens.
I think that's right. One of the issues on the issue on designation and sanctioning of individual entities is that the process tends to be easier and quicker from the UK. So the UK,
Mhm.
because of the absence of the need to get agreement of 27 member states, you might even see the UK sanction version. I mean, that's on Rosneft and
Okay.
Lukoil. We have UK and US sanctions, but no EU sanctions against those entities. So there may well be divergences, not because of a divergence in policy, but because of the process.
Thank you. Michelle, the next one I think is for you. Is it possible to determine whether oil of Russian origin is in a cargo via chemical analysis for crude and oil products?
Well, I know that it's very easy to determine the molecules from crude, but it's not possible with diesel and refined products. And I think this is once again adds to the difficulties. And I think, as you said and Daniel said earlier, shipping always finds a way, and deceptive shipping practices, there will be an element of oil traders, big names that do the right thing, that will jump through these ever
Mhm.
increasing hoops to make sure that they are compliant. But then there will be profits to be made, and there will be risks to be different risk thresholds. And so I can very easily see scenarios whereby there will be oil tanks in the Middle East Gulf and also in other countries in the Mediterranean, where there will be the mixture of Russian derived refined products that with a premium likely in Northwest Europe, that will dictate that there will be a fresh market. And because there are no ways to take samples and say, well, look, there's some there's some Russian crude in this refined product, that's just not possible, then the possibility will be there.
For sure. We also, at the beginning of the price cap, we saw multiple chains of ship to ship meetings where they mixed the crude oil. So I assume that might happen again. And the more you mix it, the harder it is to kind of verify the origin. So that might happen again.
And again, you're relying upon certification and attestation documents, and we have very little indication about how they will be enforced, if they will be
Mm.
enforced, and whether there's going to be any examples made. And I think, if there's a big high profile case, that may that may prevent so much circumvention. But everyone was saying about the oil price cap that it leaked like a sieve. We could have a similar scenario here.
For sure. Now, we got a few questions about what form of evidence is expected for different stakeholders. So I'll make it into one question. Is there a difference in the evidence requested for the origin of the crude for ship owners, banks, or any other stakeholder across the supply chain? Or is it all attestations and certificates of origins?
I'll take that. For me, that they're all the same. So we've got, so if you think about it from the question of what's prohibited, I mean, the guidance is very much focused on the importer, and there is an import ban, but the provisions also on transfer, and there are provisions on providing financial services or insurance in relation to. So I think the documents are the same. I think similarly, even from the narrow perspective of a ship owner who argue that they were not themselves the importer, the owner will still want to know they have all of the documents on board to ensure that when they arrive at the discharge port, they can berth, get the cargo off, and do whatever else they want to do. So I think even from an operational perspective, if the implicit question behind the actual question is, can others do less and just rely on the trader because they're the importer, then the answer is, I think, very clearly no. The same obligation applies to everyone. And therefore, what is, I think, mentioned at least once in the guidance is the scope for the importer to share the evidence that they obtain with everyone else who's involved in the chain, so as to avoid duplication of everyone asking the refinery the same question.
Thank you. And I think one last question, because I want to be mindful of the time. How does Article 3MA feed into the oil price cap? If Russian oil was imported in a third country in compliance with the oil price cap, would that still amount to prohibited crude oil for the purpose of refined products? And I think, Michelle, you mentioned that the oil price cap is probably going to be canceled with this coming into place. What do you think? How can we answer this question?
Well, it's quite clear if it's Russian crude, whether it's price cap compliant or not.
It's prohibited.
Yeah, entirely agree.
Thank you. Well, there are a few more questions, but I do want to be mindful of the time. And a lot of the questions are, do we think a complete transactional ban on maritime services in Russia will come into place? We don't know.
Yeah.
I think speaking for all of us when I say this, the maritime domain is very unexpected in the last couple of months and years. We'll
And
have
days.
to see, and days and hours. So we'll have to see how it plays out. But there is a big effort, especially on the EU front, to limit Russia on business-wise as much as possible. I think that's very clear. I want to thank both of you, Michelle and Daniel, for joining me today. And everyone else, thank you for joining. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to any one of us. We'll be happy to help. Thank you.